Hi, everybody. Welcome to another bonus episode of Incoming. Before we get started, I wanted to say something. Our show is made in Chicago. We are occasionally lucky enough to get contributions from other places, but in the simplest terms, our show is written and cast and recorded and edited and designed and mixed in Chicago. And as you may know, the President of the United States, in a typically sophisticated meme tweet, declared war on our great American city this week. There seem to be a few misconceptions about Chicago, and since our audience around the world might not know what to believe, I thought that I, as someone who's lived in the city since just after my 10th birthday, might clear up a few things. So, if you don't mind, I'd like to talk for just a minute about Chicago. Chicago is beautiful. It is alive. It is surprising. It is thrilling. Despite what you may have been led to believe, we all walk around and take the train and eat incredible food and visit world-class museums and go to concerts and ride our bicycles without getting murdered. We raise our kids and go swim in the lake. We catch fireflies and we work to make sure that a safe and prosperous life is available to everyone in every part of the city. We are a city of neighborhoods, a patchwork quilt of immigrant communities that settled here and made lives and then overlapped and intermingled. The Latino families of Pilsen bump up against Chinatown, and that sits next to the historically Irish Bridgeport, which is right next to Bronzeville, which gave us Quincy Jones and Ida B. Wells and Louis Armstrong and the Pope. I live on the northwest side in a neighborhood mostly comprised of Mexican and Polish immigrants and their descendants. It's strange that the administration only focuses their hatred on one of those groups. But the larger point is this. Chicago isn't a city that merely tolerates immigrants. Chicago is immigrants. We are culture and food and tradition and family from around the world, and everyone who isn't a total asshole understands that it makes living here an incredible privilege. No one, not even his most dim-witted supporters, believes that the president gives a shit about crime. He and the rest of the Oatmeal Brigade simply want to show how powerful they are by squeezing a bunch of brown and black people who came here seeking a better life. You know, like his ancestors did. And mine. But the thing is, this administration is staffed by a bunch of weak and sniveling and deeply stupid cowards, and they have picked a fight with a group of people who don't tolerate bullies. Imagine thinking that a city that produced Studs Terkel and Gwendolyn Brooks and Fred Hampton and Harold Washington and Curtis Mayfield and Mother Cabrini and Jesse Jackson and Jane Addams is going to be intimidated by these blow-dried assholes. So to our listeners around the country and the globe, you are invited, you are encouraged to come here and experience everything that makes this city and this nation full of life and culture and hope and possibility. And to those who seek to intimidate us, who want to make our friends and neighbors afraid, you ain't shit, and shut the fuck up about Chicago. And now back to our regularly scheduled program. Today, we're offering part 3 of my conversation with noted nuclear policy and weapons expert Stephen I. Schwartz. False alarms, near misses, close shaves that we've had in the nuclear age. And also at the end of the interview, you're going to hear me ask Stephen, what would you do if the missiles were on the way? And that's a question I pose to all of you out there in podcast land. What would you do if you got the alert that you had 20 minutes left? We want to know. So send me an email and tell me, david@incomingpodcast.com. Or if you're really brave and want to make an audio recording telling me what you would do with your voice and your face, we'll put it on the show. Yeah, how do you like that? So thanks for listening. Take it away, Stephen Schwartz. Let's talk about NORAD 1979.
Yeah. Okay, so for this one in 1979 at NORAD, it's November 9th. It's 8:50 in the morning. And suddenly the screens at the Strategic Air Command, at NORAD, and at the National Military Command Center, the War Room, the Pentagon, all light up saying that the United States is under a massive Soviet nuclear decapitation attack. And immediately the Pentagon and NORAD start what's known as a threat assessment conference, which is the first stage to figure out to try to assess the threat. Is this a real threat? What is the nature of the threat? How do we respond to that? That threat assessment conference lasted 6 minutes. This was all caused because somebody at NORAD inserted an exercise tape or a training tape into the system, which somehow went live to all of the warning displays. Again, as I said before, they exercise and train for this all the time to prepare for the eventuality, so nothing comes as a surprise. In this particular case, the system was somehow set up incorrectly so that the warning data, the test warning data, shows up on the live warning screens at 8:50 in the morning on November the 9th, a totally ordinary day. So an analysis afterwards found that software simulating a Soviet missile attack was inexplicably transferred into the regular warning display. And in fact, NORAD's commander-in-chief later acknowledged that the precise mode of failure could not be replicated, although they actually tried. During this false alarm, NORAD activated all air defense interceptors around the country, back when we did have air defense interceptors, and at least 10 planes actually took off.
Do we not have air defense interceptors
We have
anymore?
some, but we had a lot more.
Okay.
Back during the Cold War. We only had a handful after 9/11. We've got somewhat more now. But back during the Cold War, we had air defense interceptors stationed everywhere around the country in major cities, so that in the very unlikely event of a Soviet bomber attack, the planes could go up into the air. They actually had nuclear-tipped air-to-air missiles, among other things, and they could shoot them out of the sky. So it was important to get them off the ground early in the event that there was an attack underway, because you wanted to stop the planes before they could unload their weapons on U.S. cities or military installations, whatever they happened to be targeting. So at least 10 of these interceptors actually took off, as did the president's so-called doomsday plane, which he would use to run a nuclear
We've
war.
talked about that a little. Can you explain what the doomsday plane is?
Sure. So everybody knows Air Force One, right? It's a 747. So the doomsday plane, it's now called the National Airborne Operations Center. Back then it was known as NECAP, the National Emergency Airborne Command Post. It's basically a militarized 747 that the president and a full battle staff can use to run a nuclear war and to run the country during and after a nuclear war.
They were going to put George Bush in it after 9/11.
That was one possibility when they weren't quite sure what they were going to do.
We should talk about that. We'll do that. Okay.
But that's what that plane is. At the time of this alert, this false alarm, the airborne command post was stationed in, I believe it was in Washington, D.C. at the time. It might have been in Omaha. But in any case, it took off. It didn't take off with the president. President Carter was still in the White House. But it still took off with its battle staff, just so that there would be somebody in the air. The whole point of having this airborne command post is that if Strategic Air Command in Omaha is destroyed, if NORAD is destroyed in Colorado, if the Pentagon is destroyed, there are military leaders up in the air with the ability to take direction from the president or whoever that succeeds the president and basically run a nuclear war from the air. That's the whole point. And there's backups to this too. So the plane takes off. The president and the Secretary of Defense were never notified about this alert while it was happening. This fact actually greatly concerned Leonid Brezhnev, who was the president of the Soviet Union, who ordered his ambassador to deliver a private oral message to President Carter a few days later on November 13th about his quote-unquote extreme anxiety over the incident, which was widely reported in the press and may have also been detected by Soviet intelligence. Brezhnev in his note said to Carter, quote, according to reports, the incident was reported neither to you, nor to the Secretary of Defense, nor to any other responsible officials. It turns out that the world can find itself on the brink of a precipice without the knowledge of the president or of other top U.S. leaders, unquote. President Carter was only told about this serious false alarm 4 days later, and only indirectly, in a memorandum from Secretary of State Cyrus Vance describing Brezhnev's message. Carter replied to this note, this incident was never reported to me, nor has any analysis of the reason been given to me. Why not?
A reasonable question.
A very reasonable question.
Because I think the people, they wanted to escape culpability.
Right.
Right?
So a few days later, on November 20th, Secretary of Defense Howard Brown sent Carter a top-secret memo describing what happened during the false alarm, describing the causes and the lessons learned. Secretary of Defense Brown's takeaway was that the early warning system, mechanical, procedural, and human elements are fundamentally sound, even though this was obviously a huge snafu. On November the 23rd, National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski sent this memo back to Brown, telling him to look at President Carter's handwritten admonishment on the first page, which was only declassified last year.
Really?
Yes. And President Carter's handwritten note says, Harold, this was a serious mistake and should have been reported to me immediately. Jay.
That's what counts as stern language from the former
president.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that was one of a string of significant false alarms during the Carter administration. The one that you were talking about actually happened the following year, in 1980.
And there's a very dramatic retelling by Robert Gates in his book about it, where he says, Brzezinski didn't wake up his wife, for he assumed everyone would be dead in half an hour.
Right. Yeah, Brzezinski told Gates this. Gates was the head of the CIA some years later, but had another job at that time. And the funny thing is that there were so many of these false alarms. There were 3, in fact, in 1980, that Brzezinski conflated a couple of them and misremembered it or something. He couldn't keep track of all the different ones that happened. But there were some. That particular one in 1980, in June of 1980, June 3rd and June 6th, was a tiny computer chip, like a semiconductor, in one of the computers at NORAD, that in order for the system to work and for everybody in the command post to know that the system was working, it would send periodically data to the screens showing that there was nothing, and it was supposed to be zeros. But when the chip failed, it failed and it started sending 2s randomly. So first it was 2, and then 20, and then 200 incoming missiles. And this was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was already well underway by this point. So it wasn't complete peacetime, but it wasn't like total crisis either. But they took it, and they didn't know, what was going on.
Well, it seems like, so that's sort of like a recurring thread in the false alarm thing, is that when the systems in place send up a false alarm, whether it's human error or mechanical error or whatever it is, the human beings on the back end of that have to assess it in the context of the geopolitical world.
Right.
Like, does it make sense that someone is lobbing a missile into Sacramento right now?
Right.
Or is it like so crazy that we can assume it's a false alarm?
Right.
And most of the time, we've been able to assume it's a false alarm.
Yes.
Now that potentially more of that decision-making process is going to be off-boarded to artificial intelligence.
Right. One wonders. Yeah, I mean, given how bad AI is at answering basic questions that it hallucinates. It gives you information that's wrong. It's if the information that it has been trained on is wrong, and it won't know that it's wrong, but human beings will eventually, hopefully, then the answers that it gives will be wrong. I mean, to take your point, so a few years after this incident, in September 1983, there was a false alarm in the Soviet Union. And the guy who was running the early warning center there was a colonel named Stanislav Petrov. And the Soviets had recently launched a new satellite early warning system, but it was a little glitchy. And I'm not sure that they knew that it was glitchy yet, but this was the indication that it was. Because very early one morning, like overnight, like little past midnight, the system suddenly lights up and says that the United States has launched ICBMs against the Soviet Union. And Petrov looks at this and is puzzled because there's not a whole lot that's happening in the world. Although we had actually, they had just shot down, I think the KAL 007 Korean airliner. I think that it might have happened by that time. If you want, I can go check the date on here. But it's around. I mean, things were tense with the Soviet Union and the United States at that point anyway. But he looks at his screen. It shows that there's 5 incoming ICBMs from the United States. And he's thinking, why would they only fire 5? If you're going to launch a first strike against us, 5 isn't going to do anything. So it can't be right? So he's double checking and cross checking. It's his job to interpret the data and report it up the chain of command. He decides on his own volition to not follow standing orders, and he doesn't report it up. Or maybe he reports it up. He says, this is a false alarm. But he doesn't allow them to figure that out themselves. He tells them this isn't right. And it turns out that it wasn't. It turns out that the satellite was looking over the horizon, and there were very high icy clouds above the United States at that point, and the sunlight reflecting off of them looked just like the hot missile flare, the flare from a rocket exhaust from a US ICBM. And it just happened that it was reflecting off in 5 different places. So it looked like, to the satellite, 5 ICBMs, missiles, but it wasn't. So, but it wasn't the tensest time, but it was a relatively tense time, September 1983. If he had reported that up without saying he thought it was false, if he just let it go, or if he'd said this is real, things could have turned out very differently. He's known now as the man who saved the world. Yeah. Whether that's actually the case or not, we don't know. There are some people that I know.
Looks good on a tombstone, I'll say that.
It does. There's some people that say, well, no, other people would have interpreted this and figured out it was false.
Let's give Petrov the credit.
Right,
it's fine.
Right. But
I also think it's great that we're going to now have that decision made by the machine that can't draw fingers. I think it's good that we should take people out of the equation and let the lie generator be in charge of that.
Right.
But, okay, so another one, Norway in 1995 and Russian officers at the radar station saw a launch of what they thought was a 4-stage missile, and the altitude and distance appeared to align closely with like a Trident II submarine missile. And what the crew was unaware is they were actually looking at a research rocket sent to study the Northern Lights, right?
Right. This was another example this was a human error example. That there was an actual launch. It just wasn't what it appeared to be on the Russian radar screen. So it was January 25th of 1995. U.S. and Norwegian scientists launched what's known as a Black Brant 12 high-altitude sounding rocket from an island off of Norway to study the aurora borealis. I mean, perfectly peaceful activity.
Little Norwegians and their rockets just studying the cosmos.
And the rocket looks like that's a picture of it. You can
I'll put it on the thing.
Your listeners, but it's a very thin-looking rocket. It doesn't look at all like an intercontinental ballistic missile or a submarine-launched ballistic missile. But because the Russians didn't know where they were looking at, it looked like you said, like a Trident II T5 submarine-launched ballistic missile. And at the time that this launch happened, a few years after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, so relatively peaceful. But the Russians were worried still at that time that if the United States was going to launch an attack on Russia, it would be preceded by an attack from Trident submarines that would loft warheads high up over Russia and detonate and create an electromagnetic pulse that would wipe out their communications, blind their satellites, and disrupt their ability to track incoming warheads from the next wave, which would then destroy all of their missiles and their bombers and everything else. So that was the assumption that they were operating under. Now, the scientists, as they were required to under international law, had notified 30 countries in advance, including Russia, of the timing and purpose of this launch, specifically to avoid this very scenario. But a subsequent investigation, because there's always an investigation, revealed that this information was never shared with the Russian early warning radar operator. So somebody in Russia got
Feels
it.
like that would have been one of the people you would want to let know.
Yeah, but it didn't get passed down. So these poor radar operators, one day their screens light up. Oh my God, this looks like from where it's coming from, it's where the submarines operate. Could be one of those missiles. The track seems to be coming toward us.
Okay, but I read a thing that said that this is the only time when the nuclear briefcase has ever been opened.
So
Yeltsin must have, at least or the people around him, believed that it was possibly an attack.
Right, exactly. So that was the story that came out afterwards. But to finish up the rest of the alert, so they have this scenario in mind that this is a precursor to a first strike and not a scientific experiment. So they went on high alert for several minutes while the operators are scrambling to figure out what this radar blip is, because it looks like it's coming toward them and it looks like it's a Trident II submarine launch missile. So after 8 tense minutes, out of a reported 10-minute window when President Yeltsin and his military advisors had to verify what was actually going on. So they were within 2 minutes of running out of time. They realized, or they confirmed, that the rocket was actually heading away from rather than toward Russia, and that it was not, in fact, a Trident II.
And they just watched it, the stages fall off and.
I guess so. Yeah. So the alert was canceled, or maybe somebody rushed in and said, "Hey guys, we got this alert that it was actually a scientific." No, yet. So anyway, there were reports afterwards that Yeltsin activated his nuclear football, what's known as the Cheget, in Russia. The equivalent of the one that follows around our president. But those reports are apparently unfounded and possibly conflated with a mock alert involving the briefcase that was reportedly staged for Yeltsin's benefit the following day to show him what would need to be done had this been an actual emergency, right? So apparently I've got that from...
It's a real learn by doing society.
Yeah, I've got that from a Russian expert source, so take that for what you will. But there were public reports that's what happened. But yes, they've had their own false alarms. So.
Amazing. All right, last false alarm I want to talk about is Hawaii in 2018.
Right.
So the context of that I think people may not remember is that excuse me. The context that people may not remember is that it was at the height of the panic that North Korea might have missiles that could reach the U.S.
Well, it was at the height of the panic that Trump had started by starting basically a flame war with Kim Jong-un, and they were trading, he was talking about fire and fury like you've never seen, and Kim is saying, hey, we've got weapons, and Trump's like, my button's bigger than your button, and so they're having this very antagonistic back and forth of, whose missiles are bigger and I can destroy you.
And so there were stories in the news, like if North Korea launched a missile, and Hawaii, obviously, in the wake of Pearl Harbor, even though it was a long time ago, knows that they are uniquely positioned geographically to be a part of the U.S. that could be under attack.
Right.
You've got maybe 12 or 15 minutes from launch until impact from North Korea to Hawaii.
Right.
So cell phones, radios, TVs had a message. The U.S. Pacific Command has detected a missile threat to Hawaii. A missile may impact on land or sea within minutes. This is not a drill. If you are indoors, stay indoors. If you are outdoors, seek immediate shelter in a building. Remain indoors, well away from windows. If you are driving, pull safely to the side of the road and seek shelter in a building or lay on the floor. We will announce when the threat has ended. This is not a drill. Take immediate action measures.
Right. Yeah. I remember that. It was January 13th. It was 8:07 a.m. local time in Hawaii. It was just afternoon here in Chicago. I was at my computer, and I was I'm pretty sure I was on Twitter at that point, and a colleague of mine who lives in Hawaii posted a screenshot of the warning that you just read, or it was actually shorter on the phones, and he said, "This isn't good." And I thought, "Whoa, that does definitely not look good." And so I was immediately, I otherwise wouldn't have been aware of this at all because the alert didn't go to the continental United States. And I'm like trying to figure out what's happening, and other people are sharing screenshots and so forth. And it was very unnerving. It took 38 minutes for that alarm to be retracted as false. And in that 38 minutes, not everybody, some people just went about their day, but a lot of people in Hawaii, tourists and natives alike, were extremely concerned. There was a film that was actually produced a few years later, which unfortunately doesn't seem to be online anymore, where it interviewed a number of people and what they did. Some people went and hid in bathtubs. Some people opened up manholes and crawled down into the sewers. And there was no, and you're right. I mean, Hawaii was definitely in the crosshairs. So was Guam, for that matter. But, the missiles that North Korea had at that point, if they could have reached the United States, they might have only reached the extreme west coast, but they could have easily reached Hawaii. And so was this real? And in the context of this huge spat that Trump had basically initiated with Kim Jong-un, nobody was really sure what was going on. So, 38 minutes later, they finally figure out, they finally tell people it's a false alarm. They knew it was false, but they couldn't actually get the proper codes again to get on the airwaves to tell people that it was a false alarm. There was an investigation by the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, that found that a combination of human error and inadequate safeguards contributed to the transmission of the alert. Contrary to some initial reports, there's no evidence that it was a deliberate act by a disgruntled employee.
So the stuff that I've read about it said is it was a supervisor ran an unscheduled drill.
Right.
And he's supposed to say exercise, exercise, exercise at the end, which he did, but apparently he also said this is not a drill in it.
Right.
And then an employee who had apparently, and I'm quoting, confused real-life events and drills at least twice before, which begs the question of why that person maintained that job rather than something in a less critical role.
Right.
Believed there was an actual emergency and later attested to it, and in an interview with NBC News said that he was 100% sure it was the right decision and that it was real.
Again, people are fallible.
People are fallible.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
Yeah. So fortunately, all's well that ends well. You got a podcast out of it. Some people made documentaries out of it. Some people got incredible stories to tell about their vacations in Hawaii. But it is, it's one of the more well-known alerts today for sure because of how it reached everybody on their phones, out of the blue. And I think probably it's one thing to hear an alert on the radio if you're watching TV, but have the device that is like practically part of you light up and say, this is not a drill, duck and cover, essentially, is alarming.
So we've interviewed a few different people who were in Hawaii during the alert. And there's two sort of polarities. There's the one where people are weeping and holding on tightly and waiting for it to be over. But I think either because of human nature or because Hawaiians are pretty placid people, a lot of people are like, yeah, man, I don't think that's real. And just sort of went on about their business.
Right.
Have you thought about what you would do? You get the alert right now. Let's for the sake of argument, say you're at home.
Right.
The alert comes in, missiles inbound, take shelter immediately. What are you going to do?
Since I'm me, I would probably assume it's a false alarm, but I would also want to try to, confirm something. If it turned out to be real, I would, depending on the time of day, I would probably, gather my wife, my daughter, our cats, and, break out some chocolate, wine or something, and I would not have a whole lot of interest in living in a world that had been destroyed by nuclear weapons.
Well, that's a happy note to end on, don't you think? Once again, thank you for listening to Incoming. Thank you for telling a friend about it. Thank you for leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. That stuff is like a huge deal to us and also to get other people to listen to the show. We would love for you to be a part of Incoming. Would do if you got the alert that you only had 20 minutes left. And if you want to be brave and make an audio recording and tell us what you would do with the last 20 minutes, we'll put you right on the show. So we're working hard on season 2. You're not going to believe the stuff we have in store for you. It's going really well. We can't wait to share it with you. Talk to you soon.